My brother Dominic could do absolutely nothing wrong in our parents' eyes. Every failure became a learning experience, every mistake became evidence of how much pressure he was under, and every consequence I ever faced for minor things was somehow proof that I needed to build character. The double standard was so consistent, so total, that it stopped surprising me years ago and just became the texture of growing up in that house. He skipped family dinners to hang out with friends, and Mom would say he needed his social time. When I had drama club rehearsals on Sunday evenings, she'd guilt-trip me about missing precious family moments. Dominic got caught cheating on 3 separate tests in high school, and Dad called the principal to explain it was just stress from being so talented and overwhelmed by his own potential. When I got a B+ in chemistry, they hired a tutor because clearly I was struggling and needed intervention. He wrecked his car drunk driving at 19. My parents covered it up and bought him a brand new truck because he'd learned his lesson and needed reliable transportation. When I accidentally scraped the garage door backing out one morning, they made me pay for the repairs out of my part-time job earnings because responsibility builds character. He dropped out of college after 2 semesters and they said he was finding himself. I graduated with honors and they said that anyone can get good grades if they have no social life and just study all the time. They converted the garage into a recording studio when Dominic decided he wanted to be a musician, and he never wrote a single song or practiced once in the 2 years that studio sat there. When I asked for help with my student loans, they said they needed to be smart with money and that I needed to learn independence. Dominic would steal from Mom's purse and she'd convince herself she must have spent the money and forgotten about it. When her jewelry went missing, she assumed she'd misplaced it. When Dad's tools disappeared from the garage, he figured he must have loaned them to someone. I tried pointing out the pattern and they acted like I was jealous and looking to cause drama. He started a business with $20,000 of their retirement savings. It failed in 3 months. They said at least he tried, and that failure is the best teacher. When I asked for $1,000 to take a professional certification course that would have advanced my career, they said maybe next year when finances were better. I filed all of this away for years. Not out of bitterness, or not only out of bitterness, but because I understood that naming the pattern would only result in being told I was the problem. So I filed it away and got on with my life and tried not to think too hard about the particular exhaustion of being the child in a family who is expected to be fine regardless of circumstances. Then Grandma Vivian got sick. She was 81 and had saved carefully her entire adult life, the way people of her generation did, without complaint, without expecting anyone to notice. She had roughly $200,000 set aside that she planned to leave equally among her grandchildren. When her health began declining, Dominic transformed overnight into the devoted grandson. Visiting every day. Volunteering to manage her finances because everyone else was so busy. Staying late to help with errands. My parents praised him for stepping up. Mature, they said. So caring. Within 3 months, Grandma Vivian's savings were draining at a rate that nobody could explain. Dominic claimed it was all medical expenses and household needs, but he never had receipts. He bought her generic groceries and told the family he was getting her organic everything and pocketing the difference. He told her the heating bill was too expensive and kept the house cold while she watched television under extra blankets. He convinced her to sign over power of attorney because managing the bills was too stressful for her in her condition. My parents refused to question any of it. Dominic was being such a wonderful grandson, and how dare anyone suggest otherwise. Grandma Vivian passed away 6 months after her diagnosis. When the will was read, there was almost nothing left, barely $10,000 of the $200,000 she had saved. The attorney mentioned some unusual transfers, but noted that with power of attorney, technically everything Dominic had done was legal. My parents defended him without hesitation. He must have used it for her care, they said. We should be grateful he was there for her. That was when my cousin Nadia pulled me aside. Nadia worked at the bank. She wasn't supposed to say anything and knew it, but she'd been watching the transactions for months and couldn't carry it anymore. She showed me her documentation. Dominic had been transferring Grandma Vivian's money to his own accounts, and then, within hours, moving it directly to an online gambling platform. $200,000 over 6 months, while our grandmother ate cheap bread and sat in a cold house because her devoted caretaker told her she couldn't afford to run the heat. Nadia had screenshots of everything. The transfer dates, the amounts, the timestamps, the gambling site. Every transaction documented. She'd been building the record quietly, not knowing what to do with it because Dominic had legal authority on paper. I looked at those screenshots for a long time. Then I made some phone calls and scheduled a family meeting. I told everyone I had something important to share about Grandma Vivian's estate, nothing more than that. Dominic arrived already defensive. Before I had even said a word, he announced that if this was about money then I was being disgusting and disrespecting Grandma's memory. My parents started scolding me in agreement before I'd opened my mouth. I pulled out the printed screenshots and began passing them around the room. Here is $50,000 transferred from Grandma Vivian's account to Dominic's personal account on January 10th. Here is the same 50,000 transferred to a gambling platform 3 hours later. Here is 30,000 on January 25th, another 40 on February 3rd. Every single transfer documented with dates, timestamps, and destination accounts. Dominic tried to grab the papers, saying they were private banking records, but everyone in the room had already seen them. My Uncle Martin, who spent 22 years as a detective before retiring, stood up from his chair. He asked Dominic, in a voice he must have used 10,000 times in interrogation rooms, whether he wanted to explain why Grandma's money was going to online gambling while she was dying. Dominic said Grandma wanted him to invest it for the family's future. He called online gambling his investment strategy. The room exploded. Uncle Martin crossed the floor and positioned himself directly in front of Dominic with the particular stillness of someone who doesn't need to raise his voice to make a point. Dominic stumbled backward toward the hallway, hands up. Mom started screaming at Martin to calm down and stop attacking her son. Dad joined in, telling Martin he was being completely inappropriate and needed to back off. Martin didn't move. He just looked at Dominic and asked, quietly, if he had genuinely just described stealing $200,000 from his dying grandmother as an investment strategy. Dominic's mouth opened and closed. Sweat was forming on his forehead even though the house was cold. Mom pushed between them and put her hands on Martin's chest, shoving him, telling him he was being aggressive and threatening and she wouldn't allow this in her home. My parents physically positioned themselves on either side of Dominic like bodyguards, creating a wall between him and the rest of the room. Our cousin Nadia waited for the noise to settle and then began speaking in her quiet, deliberate way, the voice she uses at the bank when she's explaining something complicated and needs people to actually hear it. She said she'd been watching these transfers for months, that Dominic hadn't moved money once or twice. He'd been transferring funds almost every day toward the end, sometimes 3 or 4 times in a single afternoon when he was losing. She had dates, amounts, and timing on every transaction. Mom spun around and accused Nadia of violating banking privacy laws and betraying family trust. She said Nadia had no right to spy on Dominic's transactions and could lose her job for sharing confidential information. Nadia didn't flinch. She explained calmly that elder financial abuse is a mandatory reporting situation. When bank employees observe suspicious patterns of an elderly person's money being systematically drained by someone holding power of attorney, they are legally required to document it and report suspected exploitation. She had been following the legal requirements of her job, nothing more. She looked at my mother directly while she said it. Uncle Martin stepped away from the confrontation and called his contact at the Financial Crimes Unit. Dad lunged for the phone, actually tried to physically grab it from Martin's hand, yelling that this was a private family matter and we didn't need police involvement. Martin held the phone out of reach while Dad grabbed his arm. They were chest to chest, both red-faced, and for a moment I thought they were genuinely about to come to blows in the living room. Dominic made his move while everyone was looking at them. He bolted for the front door. Martin was faster. Even after 22 years off the job, he cut Dominic off before he reached the hallway and planted himself in front of the exit with his arms crossed. Dominic tried to go around him. Martin sidestepped. Dad shoved Martin with both hands, yelling at him to get out of Dominic's way. The room went completely silent except for the sound of someone crying in the corner. Then Dominic dropped to his knees in the middle of the living room floor and started sobbing, the kind of gulping, heaving sobs that sound almost theatrical but weren't, I think. Between them he admitted he had a gambling problem. He said he'd never meant for it to get this bad. He thought he could control it. He was going to pay Grandma back when he finally hit a big win. He looked up at the room with tears and told us he'd been so close to a jackpot that would have fixed everything. My parents transformed instantly. Mom dropped to her knees beside him and wrapped her arms around him, rocking him. "It's okay, baby. You're sick. This is a disease. We're going to get you through this." Dad stood up and addressed the room like a man giving a speech, announcing that Dominic had admitted to having a recognized medical condition and that we needed to focus on getting him treatment rather than punishment and blame. I stood up from my chair, still holding the bank statements. I asked, slowly and clearly, if anyone in the room remembered that Grandma Vivian lived in a cold house eating cheap food while Dominic gambled away her life savings. My parents looked at me like I had said something monstrous. Uncle Martin made his call anyway, walking toward the kitchen, his voice shifting into the flat professional register of someone reporting facts. Power of attorney abuse, elder financial exploitation, documented transfers to gambling platforms, $200,000 over 6 months, family member with banking documentation of every transaction. Detective Reyes arrived 40 minutes later. She was around 40, plain clothes, badge on her belt, with the kind of unhurried professionalism that comes from having handled a great many situations where everyone in the room believed their version of events was the correct one. She looked around at the crying relatives and the clear division of the room into 2 groups and didn't say anything about it. She just asked Nadia to walk her through the documentation. Nadia laid out everything in order. The transfers from Grandma Vivian's account to Dominic's personal account. The same amounts moving to the gambling platform within hours, sometimes within minutes. The correlation between transfer dates and the days Dominic claimed to be taking Grandma to medical appointments or picking up her prescriptions. A calendar she'd made herself, cross-referencing transaction timestamps with supposed caregiving duties. Detective Reyes photographed every page. She turned to Dominic and asked him to explain the transfers. He said Grandma knew exactly what he was doing with the money and approved of his investment strategy. She asked if he had any written documentation of her approval. He said it was all verbal, private conversations, a special relationship built on trust that didn't require paperwork. I interrupted and mentioned that Grandma Vivian had documented early dementia during her final 6 months, confirmed by her neurologist. That the power of attorney had been pushed through during the period when her judgment was already compromised. That Dominic had been the one telling the whole family she was getting forgetful and needed someone reliable to handle her finances, which was how he had secured the arrangement in the first place. Dominic's face went red. Detective Reyes made notes without expression. She asked Dominic directly whether he had transferred approximately $200,000 from his grandmother's accounts to online gambling platforms between January and June. He said he wanted to speak with an attorney before answering any further questions. My parents immediately started calling their lawyer friend who handles real estate closings. Detective Reyes said she had enough documentation to move forward with her investigation, handed me her card, and left. My parents started screaming at me and Uncle Martin the moment the door closed, accusing us of ambushing Dominic, of bringing police into a private family matter, of destroying the family over money. The week that followed was a mess of phone calls and side conversations. Uncle Martin contacted relatives individually and asked what Dominic had told each of them about Grandma Vivian's expenses. The stories didn't match. He told one aunt that Grandma needed a specialty medication costing $3,000 a month. He told a different uncle about major structural repairs, a new roof, foundation work. He told a cousin that Grandma wanted to prepay her funeral arrangements and purchase a premium burial plot. When Martin added up all the amounts Dominic claimed to have spent on Grandma's care, the total exceeded the actual $200,000 that disappeared, which meant every story was invented and none of them overlapped. Aunt Linda took it upon herself to verify what Grandma had actually spent during her final 6 months. She contacted every doctor's office, pharmacy, and service provider, requested copies of bills, and built a spreadsheet. Medical appointments, prescriptions, home health aid hours, utilities, groceries, everything documented and verified. The total came to approximately $30,000, which meant Dominic had gambled away at least $170,000 that had nothing whatsoever to do with Grandma's care. Nadia went to her bank manager and asked for permission to provide official statements. The manager reviewed her documentation and admitted the activity should have been flagged earlier, but the power of attorney paperwork had appeared legitimate and the automated systems hadn't caught it. He agreed to full cooperation with the investigation. I scheduled a meeting with a civil attorney named Mr. Caldwell who specialized in estate litigation and elder abuse cases. He had gray hair and reading glasses. He kept pushing up his nose and the measured manner of someone who has heard a great many outrageous things and long since stopped being shocked by them. I brought everything: bank statements, Nadia's timeline, Aunt Linda's expense spreadsheet, the power of attorney documents. Mr. Caldwell spent nearly an hour reviewing it all. He explained that criminal prosecution was complicated by the power of attorney because Dominic had held legal authority to access the accounts. Civil action for breach of fiduciary duty was a stronger avenue. Power of attorney creates a legal responsibility to act in the person's best interest, and using their money for personal gambling is a clear violation of that responsibility regardless of what the paperwork technically allowed. Then he gave me the hard news. Legal fees would run around $15,000, with no guarantee of recovering anything if Dominic had no assets. Even a judgment in our favor might be essentially uncollectible if he was broke and buried in gambling debts. He said the question was whether we wanted accountability on the record, or were primarily focused on getting money back, because those were different goals with different realistic outcomes. I told him I needed to talk to Uncle Martin. Martin said he was in for half the attorney fees. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about making sure Dominic faced real consequences for once in his life. We both knew our parents wouldn't contribute $1 toward a lawsuit against their son. Mom called me the day after I retained Mr. Caldwell. She was crying before she said hello. She begged me to drop the legal action because the family was already fractured and a lawsuit would destroy any chance of healing. I told her Dominic had destroyed the family when he stole from Grandma and let her live in terrible conditions while he gambled the money away. She said I was being cruel and vindictive. Dad sent an email to me and Uncle Martin warning that if we pursued legal action, they would consider it harassment and consult their own attorney about filing a countersuit. He said they had documentation of every way they'd supported us over the years and we were showing remarkable ingratitude by attacking their son in his time of need. Mr. Caldwell said it was an empty threat intended to intimidate, and told me to document all communication in case the harassment escalated. Within 3 days of us filing the retainer, Dominic had hired his own attorney, a criminal defense specialist who immediately began making statements about how Dominic's gambling addiction was a recognized mental illness that had impaired his judgment and decision-making. He was constructing a diminished capacity defense, the argument that Dominic couldn't form criminal intent because his addiction controlled his actions. My parents seized on this framing like a lifeline. Within a week they were telling everyone who would listen that Dominic was a victim of a disease who needed treatment and compassion. Mom posted on social media about the importance of supporting family members through addiction and viewing it as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. She didn't use Dominic's name, but everyone knew. Relatives who didn't know the full story about Grandma's money commented with supportive messages about how brave she was. I spent an entire weekend building a detailed timeline document. High school cheating incidents where Dad called the principal. The drunk driving accident they covered up and followed with a new truck. The failed business that burned $20,000 of their retirement savings. The money stolen from Mom's purse. The recording studio built for a musician who never played. Every double standard, every consequence I faced for minor mistakes, every time Dominic walked away from something serious without facing anything at all. 12 pages, with dates and specific incidents. I sent copies to Uncle Martin, Nadia, and Mr. Caldwell. Nadia added her own observation. She remembered Dominic borrowing $200 from Aunt Linda for car repairs that never happened. $500 from Martin's son for a business opportunity that never materialized. $300 from a cousin at Christmas 3 years ago for help with rent, never repaid. We compared notes and realized Dominic had been running small-scale financial manipulation on the family for years, always with a different story, always promising repayment, never following through. Martin approached it like the investigation he'd spent his career conducting. He contacted 8 different relatives privately and documented every interaction where Dominic had borrowed money or proposed a business arrangement. The total came to approximately $30,000 over 3 years, no repayments, each request built around a different urgency designed to discourage verification. We brought all of it to Detective Reyes. She spread the documents across her desk and studied them for a long time without speaking. Then she said this established a clear pattern of deliberate financial manipulation that significantly strengthened the case. One of the challenges with the grandma situation had been that Dominic's attorney could argue it was an isolated incident caused by addiction spiraling out of control. A pattern going back years demonstrated calculated, repeated deceptive behavior for personal gain. The addiction defense loses considerable force when you can show someone running systematic scams while supposedly impaired by their disease. Then we found the transfer to Serena. Discovery documents from the civil case included a bank statement from 3 months before Grandma died. $40,000 moved from one of Dominic's accounts to an account in Serena's name, with a memo line reading payment for business consulting services. I called Serena immediately. She went quiet on the phone when I described what we'd found, then asked me to explain it again. She said Dominic had told her it was profit from a business arrangement and that he needed to park the money in her account temporarily for tax structuring reasons. She'd spent about $15,000 of it on a car and helping her mother with medical bills, believing it was legitimate. She started crying when I told her where the money had actually come from. Serena transferred the remaining $25,000 back within 2 days and provided a written statement explaining how Dominic had deceived her about the source of the funds. She'd had no knowledge of its origin. She was another person Dominic had used. 3 days later, my phone started receiving messages from Dominic himself. The first said he was sorry for everything and knew he'd messed up badly and just wanted a chance to make it right. The second, 20 minutes later, said I was destroying his life and making it impossible for him to focus on recovery. The third said that if I really cared about family, I'd drop the lawsuit and give him space to heal. Over the following week I received approximately 30 messages cycling between apology and accusation. He said I was being vindictive, that I was choosing money over my own brother, that Mom was crying every day because of what I was doing to him. He said the lawsuit was preventing him from moving forward and that if he relapsed, it would be my fault. I didn't respond to any of them. I took screenshots of every single one and backed them up in 3 places. Mr. Caldwell said they were textbook manipulator behavior, the alternating between remorse and blame, the attempt to make me responsible for his choices, and would be useful if the case went before a judge. Mom called on a Tuesday night and said she had something important to tell me. Her voice sounded different from the usual calls, less defended, more tired, like someone who had been crying recently and was trying to hold themselves level. She said she'd been working with a therapist and had reached some recognitions about her own behavior. She acknowledged the favoritism. She acknowledged holding me to standards she never applied to Dominic. She went through specific examples from our childhood, incidents I had raised dozens of times over the years and that she had always dismissed or minimized, and she acknowledged each one. The apology felt genuine in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Like she was actually seeing the pattern rather than defending herself against it. She cried while talking about how she'd enabled Dominic for so long that she'd helped create the person who could steal from his dying grandmother. She said she needed to take responsibility for her part in that. And then she said she hoped that, now that she was acknowledging all of this, I would consider dropping the lawsuit. The apology that had felt so genuine suddenly revealed its condition. She was admitting she'd been wrong for years, but still asking me to protect Dominic from the results of his choices. The same pattern that created the situation, wearing a different coat. I told her I appreciated hearing her actually acknowledge those things out loud. That it meant something. But I explained that I needed to see sustained change in behavior over time, not words during a single phone call. Dropping the lawsuit would repeat the exact pattern of shielding Dominic from consequences that had enabled him his entire life. She started crying harder and said I was throwing her effort back in her face. I stayed calm and told her changed behavior over time was what mattered, not apologies that arrived with conditions attached. We ended the call without resolution. I felt exhausted and sad and clear. Dominic completed his 30-day gambling treatment program 6 weeks after the family meeting. My parents threw him a celebration dinner and invited the extended family to recognize his achievement and support his recovery journey. Mom called me directly 2 days before and asked if I was coming, saying it would mean so much to him to have his brother there. I told her I wasn't going to celebrate Dominic completing basic treatment he should have pursued years ago, especially when he was only in treatment because he got caught stealing $200,000 from our grandmother. She said I was being petty and holding grudges. The civil lawsuit moved to mediation shortly after. Kyle's, Dominic's attorney, had indicated they wanted to propose a settlement. We sat across a conference table from his attorney without Dominic present, which his lawyer said was standard because having both parties in the room made negotiations harder. The settlement proposal: Dominic would sign documents admitting he breached his fiduciary duty to Grandma Vivian and misappropriated her funds for personal use. He would agree to $200 a month for 10 years, payments going into an account distributed to Grandma's intended heirs. He would commit to continued treatment with quarterly verification, and if he missed payments or stopped treatment, the full remaining balance would become immediately due. Mr. Caldwell and I stepped into a smaller room to discuss it. He pulled out his calculator. $200 a month for 10 years equals $24,000 total, roughly 12% of what Dominic stole. From a pure financial standpoint, this was probably more than we'd ever collect through wage garnishment given his employment situation. The real value of the settlement was the admission of wrongdoing on legal record. Permanent, unretractable. Something no family narrative or therapist's letter could ever erase. I called Uncle Martin from the conference room. He put me on speaker so Nadia could hear. We talked it through. $24,000 is insulting compared to $200,000, Nadia said. Martin pointed out that we'd already established there was nothing to take, so the admission on record was the actual goal. I asked what they honestly thought, and after a long pause Martin said, "Accept it." The legal admission of breaching fiduciary duty would follow Dominic permanently. He would never be able to hold power of attorney for anyone. He would never manage another family member's finances. It would be part of his documented record in a way that couldn't be softened or rewritten by anyone. We went back and accepted the settlement. The signing happened in a conference room with just the 6 of us, me, Mr. Caldwell, Dominic, his attorney, and my parents, who looked like they were attending a funeral. Mr. Caldwell laid out the settlement documents and read each section aloud. This paragraph states that you, Dominic, his last name, formal, in print, acknowledge and admit that you breached your fiduciary duty as power of attorney to Vivian. This section states that you misappropriated approximately $200,000 from her accounts for personal use, specifically online gambling, between January and June. Dominic's hand shook when he picked up the pen. Mom reached over and squeezed his shoulder. He pulled away from her and signed each page where his attorney indicated. The admission was now part of his permanent legal record. It could not be erased or explained away. It would exist in official documents for the rest of his life. My parents glared at me as the copies were being made, as if I had personally destroyed their son rather than simply declining to protect him from what he'd done. 3 days after the signing, Dad called and asked if the monthly payment amount could be reduced. He said $200 a month was preventing Dominic from getting back on his feet, and maybe they could make the payments on his behalf. I reminded him that the settlement specifically required Dominic to make the payments himself, and that third-party payments would void the agreement. He said I was being unnecessarily rigid. Mom grabbed the phone and said I was choosing money over family, that she didn't raise me to be so cold and unforgiving. I hung up when she asked why I couldn't just let it go and move forward. A few weeks later I wrote out my terms for maintaining any relationship with my parents going forward. I'd attend major holidays that involved the extended family. I wouldn't attend smaller gatherings where Dominic was being celebrated for basic adult behavior. I wouldn't discuss Dominic or the lawsuit or the settlement in any conversation with them, because every conversation became a request that I adopt their version of events. I sent the terms by email so there was written documentation and so they couldn't argue with me in real time while I was explaining. Mom called within an hour and spent 20 minutes trying to negotiate. She said families are supposed to forgive and move forward together and that my boundaries were just another way of punishing Dominic and them. I repeated that these were my terms for maintaining any relationship at all and that I wasn't negotiating them. She said I'd regret this someday when it was too late to fix things. The boundaries held, though she tested them constantly. She'd call with new angles. Dominic was doing so well in recovery and it would mean so much to him if I came to his birthday dinner. He'd gotten a small promotion and they were having a little celebration. She sent photos from family gatherings I'd declined, with captions about how sad it was that I was missing these moments. Dad made passive-aggressive comments at the holidays I did attend, how nice it was when the whole family could be together without drama and division, how family loyalty and forgiveness used to mean something. I didn't take the bait. I changed subjects or walked away. Uncle Martin and Aunt Linda became my primary family. We started having dinner together on Tuesday evenings and they'd call on weekends to check in. Martin made a point of including me in things he knew my parents wouldn't attend, games, hiking, a road trip one weekend up to the coast. When Mom called Linda crying one night asking her to explain that families are supposed to stick together no matter what, Linda told her that sticking together doesn't mean protecting people from consequences, and that if they'd held Dominic accountable years ago, Grandma would still have her savings. Mom hung up on her. Nadia and I got much closer through everything that happened. We started meeting for dinner once a month and would spend hours talking about family patterns, comparing notes on years of watching Dominic operate with total impunity while feeling slightly crazy because no one else seemed to see it the same way. We realized we'd both spent decades being quietly told we were the ones who saw things wrong. I started seeing a therapist about 3 months after the family meeting. I'd been carrying an enormous amount of anger and hurt and a specific kind of grief that took a while to name, not just grief about Grandma, and not just about the money, but about the fantasy of having parents who would choose what's right over what's comfortable. My therapist helped me understand that I'd spent years waiting for a moment that would finally make them see the pattern clearly, and that the moment had come and they had chosen Dominic anyway, and that sitting with that reality was the actual work. She said I could love my parents while accepting that our relationship would never be what I'd hoped, and that both things could be true at the same time without either of them canceling the other out. That helped more than I expected it to. Kyle's, Dominic's first settlement payment came through on time. The second, exactly 30 days later. Mr. Caldwell sent confirmation emails and I filed them away. I had no way of knowing whether Dominic was genuinely working on his addiction or just managing appearances to satisfy the settlement terms. I accepted fairly early on that this wasn't my responsibility to monitor. My responsibility was to myself and to honoring Grandma Vivian's memory by ensuring that someone in the family insisted on consequences, even minimal ones, rather than letting the whole thing be absorbed into the ongoing story of Dominic's difficult journey. Uncle Martin invited me over for coffee one Saturday morning after the second payment cleared. We sat on his back porch and he told me that Grandma Vivian would be proud. He said she had her own history with family members who took advantage of her, a sister who borrowed money constantly and never repaid it, a brother she'd co-signed a loan for who defaulted. She spent decades being the family doormat because she believed being forgiving was the same as being good. Martin said that toward the end of her life she'd told him she wished she'd had more backbone earlier. That the people she respected most were the ones who did the right thing even when it cost them something. He said I had the backbone she wished she'd developed sooner, and that she would have been grateful someone finally held Dominic accountable even though it fractured things. I sat with that for a while on his porch, watching the light change in the yard. Grandma Vivian in her cold house, under extra blankets, watching her stories on television. Believing her grandson was taking care of her. Trusting someone who had decided she was a resource rather than a person. For months after everything came out, I hosted a small Thanksgiving at my apartment. Uncle Martin, Aunt Linda, Nadia, and a few other relatives who had stood up for what was right in that living room. We ordered food rather than cooking because nobody wanted to spend hours in the kitchen pretending. Nadia brought her new boyfriend. Martin told stories about Grandma Vivian that made us laugh instead of cry. We played cards and nobody mentioned Dominic or my parents or the settlement once across the entire evening. It felt strange to celebrate a holiday without the full family. It also felt like something I hadn't experienced in a long time, which was a room full of people who were glad to be in the same room without having to manage what anyone was performing or concealing. We decided to make it a regular thing. The thing I keep coming back to, more than the money or the legal process or any of the specific confrontations, is something simpler. My whole life I tried to earn my parents' recognition by doing everything right. Good grades, reliable, independent, never asked for more than I needed. And Dominic spent his whole life receiving unconditional protection regardless of what he did wrong. When the moment came that should have finally made the pattern impossible to maintain, when the evidence was physical, documented, undeniable, they chose him again. That realization hurt worse than any amount of stolen money, because it meant accepting that nothing I could ever do would change the calculation. There was no version of being good enough that would change what I was in that family. I'm learning to accept them as they actually are, rather than continuing to hope they might become the parents I needed them to be. My therapist says that's the work, and she's right that it's work. It doesn't happen once, it happens in small increments, and then it has to happen again. But I also think about what Uncle Martin said on the porch. About Grandma Vivian and the backbone she wished she'd developed sooner. About the people she respected most being the ones who did the right thing even when it cost them something. Dominic's legal admission is part of the permanent record now. He cannot hold power of attorney for anyone. He cannot manage another person's finances. He cannot tell a new version of this story without the old one existing in official documents. That's not the justice that exists in movies, where someone finally understands what they've done and everything resolves into something clean. But it's real, and it's permanent, and it came from refusing to let the pattern continue one more time. That has to be enough, and most days, it is. If any part of this reached something in you, if you've ever been the one in your family who was expected to be fine no matter what, while someone else was protected no matter what, leave that in the comments. You don't have to explain the whole story. Just, me too. Or, I needed to hear this today. Please like if this story found you. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Take care of yourselves. That's the first thing, not the last.